Assalamu Alaikum.
Walaikum Assalam.
Today I am going to tell you the story of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. Are you ready?
Yes.
Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam plays a very important role in Islam. He fulfilled all the commandments and trials God gave him during his life. As a result of his unwavering faith, he was promised by God to be a leader of all the nations in the world. Now, let's start his story. Bismillah. The story of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was born in the kingdom of Babylon a long time ago. He was blessed with wisdom even when he was a child, and this made him very special. The Prophet was born during a time when the people worshipped the sun, the moon, the stars, and they worshipped even the idols made out of stone. Ibrahim's father was a sculptor, and he used to make the idols with his own hands. His father never used to worship Allah at all. As a child, he used to sit and watch his father carving out these statues from stone. Ibrahim got curious about these funny-looking statues, and sometimes he used to play with them. But when he saw the same statue in temples, he got confused. He wondered why the people were prostrating before these stone idols. So he decided to ask his father about it. One day when his father was carving a statue of Mardukh, the Prophet asked his father, "Baba, why are people worshipping these toys that you are making yourself?" "They represent our gods," his father replied. "We should worship them to get favors from gods." "Why does it have such big ears, Baba?" the Prophet asked. "This statue is the god of gods, the Mardukh," he replied. The big ears represent his deep knowledge. Even though Ibrahim was only 7 years old at that time, he couldn't control his laughter. As time went by, Ibrahim grew with knowledge and wisdom. He knew that Allah was the only true God. His hatred for the idols increased as he grew older. Ibrahim had now turned 16 years old. Whenever he went to the temple along with his father, he was sad to see his people still praying to the idols. He saw that the people were offering sacrifices, seeking forgiveness of their sins. One day, Ibrahim left his home in search of Allah, the true God. He walked for a very long time, and finally he reached a mountain nearby. He climbed the mountain and sat near a cave nearby. He sat there for a very long time, and when he looked up, he saw a shining star. When he saw the beauty of the star, he wondered if this star could be Allah. But after a while, the star disappeared. He realized that the star was not Allah, as the true God will never set or disappear. After a while, the moon came up. The moon was very beautiful. So Ibrahim wondered if the moon could be Allah. He sat there gazing at the moon for a long time. But after a few hours, when the moon disappeared from the horizon, he realized that the moon was not Allah. Ibrahim was disappointed, but he continued to sit there on the top of the mountain watching the horizon. It was early morning by now, and that was when the sun came up. He looked at the bright sun and wondered again if this could be Allah, as it was bigger and very bright. But by evening, when the sun set in the horizon, he realized that it was not Allah, as the true God would never set. It was then Ibrahim realized that the true God can never be created. He understood that Allah is the creator of everything, even the sun, the moon, and the stars. He then prostrated on the ground offering his thanks. He knew that Allah had just guided him to the truth. It was then he realized that Allah had chosen him to be a prophet. God had chosen him to guide his people. It was going to be a new life for Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. He then traveled back home to tell his father about the great news. But when his father heard what he was saying, he got very, very angry. "How dare you reject my gods?" he asked angrily. "Oh my father, follow me. I will guide you on the right path. Allah will punish you if you don't repent." The Prophet pleaded with his father. "I will ask people to stone you if you don't stop speaking like this." His father shouted at him. The Prophet was then asked to leave the house by his father. Ibrahim was sad for his father, for he had turned him away. He realized he could do nothing more. So he left home and walked away. He then went to the other people in his kingdom to guide them. He realized that it was his mission to call people back to Allah. Ibrahim went to the market and shouted to them, "Allah is the one and only true God. There is no other God but Allah. There is nobody worthy of worship except Him. I will not bow down to the idols anymore." The people at the market got really angry when they heard him speak like this. "Why do you worship these idols?" he asked them. "Don't you realize they have no power?" The people threatened him to go away, so Ibrahim had to leave the market. But the Prophet thought of a plan to show them that the idols were not real gods. One day there was a big celebration near the river bank, and the Prophet knew that everyone in the city would be present there. The Prophet waited till he was sure that there was nobody left in the town. He then took an axe and went inside the temple. There were many idols kept inside the temple, and the Prophet started smashing the idols with his axe. One by one he smashed all the idols except for one. That was the biggest idol inside the temple. He hung the axe around the neck of the statue and left the temple. The next day, when the people of the town came to the temple to worship, they were shocked to see the idol smashed into pieces. The pieces were lying around all over the place. They gathered together and discussed who could have done this terrible act. "There was a young man at the market yesterday," one of them said. "He was speaking against our gods." "I know this person. His name was Ibrahim," said the other. The people found Prophet Ibrahim and brought him to the temple. "Are you the one who has done these to our gods?" they asked him. "It was the statue here. Yes, that big one," the Prophet replied. "Why don't you ask him? He will tell you if he can speak." This angered the people further. "You know very well that these idols do not speak." Then Prophet Ibrahim said, "Then why do you worship these idols who cannot speak, nor do they see or hear? Have you lost your minds?" The people were ashamed and looked around, and they saw the shattered pieces of idols lying everywhere. Some of them realized that Ibrahim was saying the truth, but the others were still very angry with him. "Punish him!" they shouted. They wanted to take revenge for shattering the idols. They tied him in chains and gathered around to discuss how they were going to punish the Prophet. "Let's burn him in fire," one of them said. "Let's build the biggest fire anyone has ever seen and throw him into it." Everyone thought it was a great idea. The people of Babylon then started building a fire so large that even the birds could not fly above it. It was so hot that the people couldn't go near it.
MashaAllah, that was such a great story.
That's all for today. I'll tell the rest of the story tomorrow.
Okay, Baba.
Shall I ask you a few questions from the story?
Yes.
Where was Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam born?
Babylon. He was born in Babylon.
MashaAllah, that's the right answer. Now tell me, what did the Prophet's father do? I'll give you some options. Option A, carpenter. Option B, sculptor. Option C, woodcutter.
This one was so easy. It was option B. He was a sculptor.
Right again. Now for the next question. Tell me, why was the Prophet asked to leave from the house?
The Prophet refused to worship the idols, and this made his father very angry. That's why his father asked him to leave the house. Isn't that right, Baba?
That's correct, my son. Why were the people of Babylon angry at the Prophet?
The Prophet wanted to teach the people of Babylon a lesson, so he smashed all the idols they worshipped.
MashaAllah, that's the right answer. That's all for today. I'll tell you the remaining story tomorrow. Good night.
Good night.
Assalamu Alaikum.
Walaikum Assalam. I was waiting for you, Baba.
You look so excited.
Yes, Baba, I really wanted to know what happened to the Prophet. Did the people throw him in fire? What happened to him?
All right, I will tell you the rest of the story now. Listen carefully. Bismillah. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam and the great fire. When people realized that it was Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam who had destroyed the idols, they were really angry. They decided to burn him in the biggest fire anyone had seen before. First, they dug a deep hole to put the firewood. They gathered all the wood they could find and started building a fire. The people kept adding the woods for days and days, and the fire grew stronger and stronger. It is said that the fire grew so strong that no one could go near it because of the heat. It was so tall that not even the birds could fly above it. Many people heard about this huge fire in Babylon and traveled to the city to witness this phenomenon. Then one day the people tied the hands and feet of Ibrahim alayhi salam and placed him on a catapult so that he could be thrown into the fire. It was then an angel from heaven appeared before the Prophet and asked him if he wanted any wish to be granted. The Prophet could have easily asked the angel to save him from the fire, but he did not. I only wish for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be pleased with me, he said. What followed was a miracle. When the Prophet landed in the fire suddenly got cold. It only burned the ropes that tied the Prophet. And no harm came to the Prophet. The Prophet sat there amidst the fire, as if he was sitting in a garden. He sat there and sang praises of Allah. The people couldn't see what was happening, so they waited for the fire to finish burning. And finally, when the fire went out, the Prophet walked out of the fire with not a single burn in his body. The people were shocked to see this. This was a miracle. The God of Ibrahim must be the true God, some of them said. But most of them were still angry with the Prophet for destroying the idols. They decided to take the Prophet for a trial to the king's palace. The soldiers came and arrested the Prophet and took him to the palace of King Nimrod. He was taken to the palace with his hands chained. Nimrod had heard that the Prophet had shattered the idols he worshipped. "Tell me why you smashed the idols we worship," he asked the Prophet. "They were false idols. They were not God," replied the Prophet. "Then who is the true God?" Nimrod asked. The Prophet politely replied, "There is only one true God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He gives life and death." The king got angry when he heard the Prophet. He stood up angrily and said, "I can give life and death too. Wait and I'll show you." He asked his soldiers to bring 2 of his slaves to the courtroom. He asked the slaves to kill the first one. The guard, on hearing the order, struck the sword and killed one of the slaves. "You see, I can give death," said Nimrod proudly. "Now kill the other one too," said Nimrod to the guard. But before the guard could strike the slave with his sword, he asked him to stop. He then shouted to the guard, "Don't kill him! Let him live!" He then turned to the Prophet and said, "I can give life too. You just saw that." The Prophet replied, "Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes the sun rise from the east. Can you make the sun rise from the west? Can you do that?" Nimrod was speechless. He was really angry with the Prophet for confronting him. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam called the people to worship Allah for a long time. There were nobody willing to listen in Babylon except for one man and a woman. The woman's name was Sarah, and later she became his wife. The man's name was Lut, who would later become a prophet as well. After years of calling people to Allah, the Prophet realized that nobody else was going to listen to his words. So he decided to migrate to another country. He wanted to spread the message of Allah in another nation. The Prophet then asked his father to join him, but he refused. The Prophet, the woman, and Lut alayhi salam then started their long journey. They traveled through Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, calling out the people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They helped the poor they could find on the way. And they did many good deeds that made people happy. In the meantime, the Prophet Lut alayhi salam migrated to the Dead Sea and settled down there. And after a few months, the Prophet married Sarah. She was a good believer, and they wanted to have children who would spread the message of Allah after their time. The Prophet and his wife traveled again for many days through the desert. One day, they happened to enter the territory of an evil king. The evil king came to know about the beautiful wife of the Prophet, and he wanted to take her. So he sent one of his soldiers to bring the Prophet to him. The soldier brought the Prophet before the king. "Who is the lady accompanying you?" asked the evil king. The Prophet replied that she was his sister. The evil king then asked the Prophet to bring Sarah to his court. He said that he wanted to meet this beautiful woman that everyone in his kingdom was talking about. The Prophet went to his wife and said, "The king wants to meet you. Do not ever tell him that you are my wife, because I have told him that you are my sister." The Prophet told his wife. When Sarah went to the king's palace, the king was struck by her beauty, and he tried to take hold of her with his hands. But the moment his hand got near Sarah, it became stiff and he could not move it. The king was scared and he requested Sarah, "Please pray to Allah for me and I will never harm you." When Sarah prayed to Allah, his hands got cured miraculously. But the moment he realized that his hands were cured, the foolish king tried to take hold of Sarah again. And for the second time, his hands got stiff. The king couldn't move his hands at all. "Please pray to Allah for me. I shall never harm you again," said the king. Sarah prayed to Allah again and his hands got cured for the second time. This time the king realized that Sarah was no ordinary woman. So he gave Sarah a gift. He gave her one of his Egyptian maidservant and her name was Hajar. When Sarah returned home, the Prophet asked her what happened. "Allah taught that evil king a lesson and he gave me a maid." Hajar replied Sarah. Years passed and the Prophet grew old. His hair grayed. But he continued to call people back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sarah too had grown old and she realized that she would no longer be able to give birth to a child. So she asked the Prophet to marry their servant Hajar. She then prayed to Allah to bless them with a child. After a few months, Hajar gave birth to a child and they named him Ismail. By now, the Prophet had grown very old. One day the Prophet woke up. He felt like Allah wanted him to do something. So he went to Hajar. "Get Ismail," he said. "Get ready for a long journey." Ibrahim alayhi salam and his wife with the baby in her arms kept traveling for a long time. They walked for many days till they reached the dry valley of the desert near the Al-Marwa mountain. There were no fruits, no trees, no food, and no water either. No signs of any life could be found in the valley. The Prophet then left his wife and son with a small amount of food and water. This was hardly enough for both of them to last for 2 days. The Prophet then turned around and started walking away. His wife hurried after him. "Where are you going, leaving us in this barren valley?" she cried to him. But the Prophet did not answer her and kept walking away. She called him again, but the Prophet remained silent and walked away. Finally, she understood that the Prophet was not acting on his own. She realized that Allah had commanded him to do this. "Did Allah command you to do so?" she asked him. The Prophet shook his head and continued walking. Then his great wife said, "We are not going to be lost, since Allah who commanded you is with us." The Prophet was very sad as he had left his wife and his son in a barren desert where there were no other people. He prayed to Allah to give his wife and son enough food. And he asked Allah to send people with good hearts to them.
Oh no! Why did the Prophet leave his wife and son? Why did he do that?
It was because Allah had commanded him.
What happened next?
I will tell you the remaining story tomorrow.
Okay, Baba.
Before I leave, let me ask you a few questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Now tell me, why was the Prophet thrown into the fire? Here are the options. Option A, because he had smashed the idols they worshipped. Option B, he stole their idols. And option C, he burned the idols.
That's an easy one. The Prophet was thrown in fire because he smashed the idols the people worship.
MashaAllah, that's the right answer.
Thank you, Baba.
How did the Prophet challenge King Namrud?
The Prophet asked the king if he could make the sun rise from the west. Isn't that right?
That's right again. Now tell me, who accompanied the Prophet when he left Babylon?
The Prophet's cousin Lut joined him, and another believer, Sarah, too accompanied him.
That's very good. What was the name of the Prophet's first son?
It was Ishmael alayhi salam.
MashaAllah, that's right again. It's time for me to leave. Insha'Allah, I'll tell you the remaining story tomorrow. Assalamu Alaikum. Are you ready for today's story?
I can't wait to know what happened to them in the desert.
So excited, huh? Alright, let me start from where we stopped yesterday. Bismillah. The test of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam left his wife and his son in a barren desert as commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He had left them with a small amount of food and water that would hardly last for 2 days. He walked away praying that they would be found by good people. Hajar radiallahu anha drank the water that the Prophet had left so that she could feed her son. The water got over very soon and both of them started getting very thirsty. After some time, the baby started getting thirsty and started to cry. She ran to a hill close by called Al-Marwa, hoping that she might find somebody. She stood there hoping to find somebody, but she did not. Then she ran to the next mountain called Al-Safa, hoping to find someone from there. But she couldn't find anyone from there either. She kept running between these mountains 7 times. When she climbed Al-Marwa for the last time, she was very tired. She got so tired that she sat next to her baby. It was then she heard a voice. She kept quiet and waited to hear the voice again. When she heard the voice for the second time, she said, "Oh, whoever you might be, you have made me hear your voice. Have you got something to help me?" That was when she saw an angel digging the earth. The angel kept digging till the water flowed from it. It was a miracle. When she saw the water, she ran toward it and started to build a basin around it. She scooped the water with her hands and drank from it. Then she filled the water bag and ran towards her child. This place where the water rose is called Zamzam. After a few days, some people were traveling through Mecca. They saw the birds flying around Al-Marwa and they thought the birds might be flying around the water. They started walking towards Al-Marwa. When they arrived, they were surprised to find a woman with a baby sitting near the water. "Shall we stay here and use this water, please?" they asked her. Hajar said yes, and they drank water from the Zamzam. Like that, many others came to Al-Marwa and eventually settled down there. The whole valley became alive now, and she and her child were not alone anymore. Ismail grew up and learned Arabic from the people who had settled down at Al-Marwa. He was a good boy, and his virtues and qualities made the people admire him. He kept thinking about his father and knew that his father will come back someday. Ismail then married a local woman and lived his life in peace. In the meantime, Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was very sad because he had not seen his son for a very long time. One day, he decided to go to Mecca to meet his wife and his son. He traveled for many days and finally arrived at Al Marwa. But it was very late. When he arrived, people told him that Hajar had died some time ago. The Prophet was very sad to hear this. And then the local people told the Prophet that his son, Ismail, was still alive. The Prophet was very happy to hear this and thanked Allah. When Ismail saw his father, he ran to him and hugged him very tightly. He could not believe his eyes. He was very happy to see his father after a long, long time. It was a very happy time for both of them. But one day, Allah decided to test Ibrahim. One night when the Prophet was sleeping, he saw a dream. In his dream, the Prophet saw himself killing his son as a sacrifice to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet woke up and ignored it as it was just a dream. But the next night, he saw the same dream again. This time he realized that this was not just a dream and that Allah was asking him to sacrifice his own son. The Prophet went to his son and told him about the dream. Ismail realized that it was an order from Allah. Do what Allah has asked you to, he told his father. The next day, the Prophet took a rope and a knife and set out for Mount Arafat along with his son. Upon reaching the top of the mountain, Ismail asked his father to tie his hand and legs so that he might not struggle during the sacrifice. The Prophet obliged and tied his hands and legs. Then he blindfolded himself so that he won't have to watch his son suffer. The Prophet raised his knife, but then suddenly he heard a voice from the sky. He took off his blindfold and saw a sheep being sent from heaven. Allah had sent a sheep to be sacrificed instead of Ismail. The Prophet was really happy because his son was going to be alive. The Prophet and his son had just passed a difficult test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ibrahim alayhi salam slaughtered the sheep and they had a big celebration. The Prophet and his son kept calling people to worship Allah. They didn't have any place to worship Allah, so one day Allah ordered the Prophet to build a house. Allah has ordered me to build the Kaaba, the Prophet said to his son. And Ismail replied, do what your God has ordered you to do. The Prophet then asked his son if he help him build the Kaaba, and Ismail agreed. They started building the foundation of the Kaaba. Ismail alayhi salam brought the stones while Ibrahim alayhi salam built the house. When the walls got tall, Ismail brought a large stone for the Prophet to work by standing on it. This stone was called Maqam Ibrahim. When they completed the foundation and built the corners, Ibrahim asked Ismail to find the stone to fill the corner. I feel tired, Ismail said to his father. But when Ibrahim insisted, Ismail went searching for the stone. While he was gone, an angel got the Prophet a stone. The angel told him that this stone was brought to earth by Adam alayhi salam from paradise. The stone was originally white. However, its color gradually turned into black because of the sins committed by people on earth. Ismail returned after some time, and when he saw the stone, he was surprised and asked his father where it came from. It was brought by someone who never gets tired, replied Ibrahim. And they finally completed building the Kaaba. They prayed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept their work. Allah was very happy with the Prophet and his son for spreading his message, and proclaimed the pilgrimage among men. They will come to thee on foot and on every kind of camel, lean an account of journeys through deep and distant mountain highways. The Prophet grew old, and so did his wife Sarah. One day, when he was sitting outside his house, he saw three men coming towards his house. The three men were actually angels sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet welcomed them inside to have food. The strangers went in and sat down for food. The Prophet served them a roasted calf, but the strangers did not touch the food at all. The Prophet started to fear. Then the angels comforted the Prophet and asked him not to fear at all. They told him that they were actually the angels sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They informed him that they came to his house to deliver a good news. They said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was going to give them a son and that he should name him Ishaq. They also told him that his son would be a prophet. Sarah could not believe her ears. How could that be true? She wondered. I am so old. Then the angel said all these things are possible with Allah. After a few months, Sarah got pregnant and gave birth to a child. The Prophet named him Ishaq, as the angels told him. After a few years, Prophet Ibrahim missed his son Ismail badly, so he went to see him. But when the Prophet reached the house of Ismail, he was not at home. His wife came out, and when the Prophet asked her about Ismail, she replied, "He has gone in search of livelihood." He then asked her how was their living conditions, to which she started complaining about everything. She complained that they were living in misery and hardship, and many other things. She was not at all grateful to the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet realized that she was not at all a suitable wife for his son, so left her a message that his son would understand. When your husband returns, convey my salutations to him, he said, and also tell him to change the threshold of the gate. The Prophet then went back to his home. When Ismail returned home in the evening, he felt something unusual. Did anyone visit us today? He asked her. She replied, yes, and passed on the message. When Ismail heard the message, he realized that it was his father who visited him that day, and he understood the message that he gave her. It was my father, and he has advised me to divorce you. You can go back to your family, he told her. His wife went back to her house, and Ismail married another woman. After a long time, Prophet Ibrahim again missed his son badly, so he visited his new house once again. When he arrived, it was his new wife who answered the door. The Prophet asked the same questions he had asked his former wife. But this time when she answered, the Prophet realized that she was a very grateful and kind woman. She kept thanking Allah for the wonderful things going on around, and the Prophet was very happy. When your husband comes home, give him my regards, the Prophet told Ismail's wife. He also added, and also tell him that he should keep the threshold of this gate firm. He left after asking her to deliver the secret message. In the evening, when Ismail came back, he asked his wife if anyone had come to visit him. When his wife told him about the Prophet and the message, Ismail was very happy. It was my father, said Ismail, and you are the threshold of the gate. He asked me to keep you with me forever, said the Prophet happily. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam lived for 175 years. He lived a life full of trials, but he had a strong faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The life of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam teaches us to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unconditionally. Even though there are more than 25 prophets mentioned in the Quran, Allah mentions only 2 prophets, ideal for whole humanity, and they were Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam.
MashaAllah, that was such an amazing story.
So you like the story of Ibrahim?
I loved it, Baba.
All right, now let me ask you a few questions from the story. Shall I?
Go ahead.
Tell me the names of the mountains that Hajar radiyallahu anha ran across.
They were Al-Safa and Al-Marwa.
That's the right answer. Now tell me how the travelers found the Prophet's wife. I'll give you 3 options. Option A, they saw animals running towards the mountain. Option B, they saw water flowing down the mountain. Option C, they saw birds flying above the mountain.
It was option C. The travelers saw the birds flying above the mountains.
That's right again. The next question. How did God test Ibrahim alayhi salam?
I know that one. God asked Ibrahim to sacrifice his only son, Ishmael.
And did he sacrifice his son?
No, just before the sacrifice, God told the Prophet that he was testing him. And God sent a sheep instead for the sacrifice.
MashaAllah, that's the right answer. You are doing great, my son.
Thank you, Baba.
Why did the color of the stone that the angels brought turn from white to black?
It was because of the sins committed by the people on earth.
Excellent. And now for the last question. What was the name of the second son of the Prophet?
It was Ishaq alayhi salam. Isn't that right, Baba?
Yes, my son, that's the right answer. That's all for today. Insha'Allah, I will tell you the story of Prophet Ismail alayhi salam tomorrow.
Which story are you going to tell me tomorrow?
Insha'Allah, I will tell you the story of Prophet Ismail alayhi salam tomorrow.
Thanks, Baba.
Good night.
Good night.